Diffusion, the international science radio show.
We have a bouncer on the doors of perception.
The good, the bad, the ugly.
It gets pretty exciting.
The myths, the truths.
Toxicology.
Astroseismology.
Magnetism. The dark side.
Genetically engineered potatoes.
Planetoid.
I
love that word.
Hello and welcome to Diffusion. Sit back and relax while we engineer weird and wonderful science irradiated directly into your genes. I'm Ian Woolf. On this edition, I deep dive into the Australian government's search for a national nuclear waste dump. Later, sex in space. The Australian government is working to open a national radioactive waste dump on Aboriginal land. Australian governments have been trying to create a near-surface national radioactive waste repository since 1985. Every time they survey many different areas and then decide on Aboriginal native title land. It can be argued that all land in Australia is Aboriginal-owned land, but in practice, Aboriginal people hold title and live on very little of the land. It seems a bit racist to insist that you will only create a national radioactive waste dump on land that Aboriginal people own under the law and are living on. The world's best practice for low-level waste is a near-surface shallow grave. For world's best practice for intermediate and high-level waste, it must be stored deep underground, in places least likely to have volcanoes or earthquakes, nowhere near underground water flows or reservoirs, nowhere near bodies of water, and not prone to flooding. An old uranium mine might be best. After all, that's where radioactive waste from mining uranium is stored. The Australian federal government plans for a shallow grave near-surface radioactive waste repository for both intermediate level waste returned from overseas and intermediate and low-level waste generated around Australia. This will not be the world's best practice and will violate the International Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material. Currently, over 5,000 cubic metres of radioactive waste from research and industry is stored in over 100 locations around Australia, including Woomera in South Australia, near the place where rockets used to be launched, Esk in Queensland, and at the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation ANSTO at Lucas Heights in suburban South Sydney, in New South Wales. In 1985, the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation ANSTO was opened. One of their long-term projects was to continue a 1978 Australian National University project to develop a form of synthetic rock, synrock, to safely lock up radioactive waste in a crystalline structure. Radioactive waste used to be stored in glass, until it was shown that glass leaks all the waste into water over a relatively short time. Synrock was the world's last best hope for safe disposal of radioactive waste. It failed. It was discovered in 2007 by a team from Cambridge University, led by Professor Ian Farnan, that synrock leaks radioactive material into any water that passes by, and all the material would be leaked after only 1,400 years instead of the 240,000 years that high and intermediate level waste needs to be locked away from the environment. It was a good theory that completely failed in practice. 12 years later, ANSTO are still showcasing synrock without addressing the fact that it leaks all the waste before the waste stops being dangerous. The timeline for the Australian government's handling of nuclear waste was really hard to source. A lot of the government departments have changed their name, and therefore their website addresses that are in Google aren't correct anymore. Nonetheless, I looked and looked and looked, and here it is. In 1988, the Northern Territory government agreed to a Commonwealth-funded feasibility study of a repository in the Northern Territory, which was completed in 1989. However, in May 1991, after a public backlash, the Northern Territory government advised the Australian government of its decision not to host the repository. In 1992, the Australian government started a new search for somewhere else to site a national radioactive waste dump. In 1999, the Western Australian state government passed legislation banning a national nuclear waste dump from being built in Western Australia. In 2000, the Australian government tried to establish a shallow grave, near-surface national nuclear waste dump in Billa Kalina, Aboriginal native title land in South Australia. In response that year, the South Australian state government passed legislation banning a national nuclear waste dump in South Australia, with a sunset clause while they thought about it. In 2003, the South Australian state government passed legislation permanently banning a national nuclear waste dump. In response, the Australian federal government rushed through a compulsory acquisition to buy Arkuna Station in Woomera in South Australia to build a low-level radioactive waste dump, against the wishes of the South Australian state government and the Aboriginal people who owned and lived on the land. In July 2004, the Australian High Court overturned the federal government's compulsory acquisition of Arkuna Station. In response, the Australian government announced it will store medium-level and low-level waste in the same facility, either onshore or out on an island, but not in South Australia. In August 2004, the Environment Minister Ian Campbell made an election promise that radioactive waste will only be stored on islands offshore from Australia and never mainland Australia, which would appear to contradict the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty Act of 1986. In November 2004, the Northern Territory passed legislation banning a radioactive waste dump and banning the transport of radioactive waste from outside of the Northern Territory. In December 2004, the Australian government announced that used-up fuel rods from the new Opal research nuclear reactor at Lucas Heights will be sent to America to extract the valuable bits. The nuclear waste left over would be returned to Australia in 2016 as intermediate level waste. Used fuel rods from the old HIFAR reactor were sent to France to extract the valuable bits and were returned to Australia as intermediate level waste in 2015. In March 2005, ANSTO is refused a licence for their new Opal research reactor because of a lack of a nuclear waste management plan. In September 2005, former Prime Minister Bob Hawke calls for Australia to become the place where the world dumps all of its nuclear waste. In October 2005, the Australian government passes the Commonwealth Radioactive Waste Management Bill 2005, which trumps all of the states and territories' prohibitions of national nuclear waste dumps in their borders, and allows the Australian government to put a national nuclear waste dump anywhere they like. In May 2006, the Australian Prime Minister John Howard, in consultation with the American President George W. Bush, announces that the Australian government will consider taking high-level nuclear waste from any country in the world that buys Australian uranium. In June 2006, the public discovers that the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation has had 13 serious radioactive accidents in the previous 18 months, including one case of serious radiation exposure. In July 2006, Prime Minister Howard rules out taking other countries' nuclear waste. In the same month, the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation's Opal reactor gets its licence to operate, despite still lacking a waste management plan. On the 8th of May 2007, Muckaty Station near Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory is nominated by one of 7 Aboriginal clans living in the area in return for $12 million, despite being geologically unstable with underground aquifers. However, it is conveniently close to the Darwin to Alice Springs rail line, which would make it easy for nuclear waste to be imported by ship. On the 28th of May 2008, the Australian government gave the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation $4 million towards storing its own radioactive waste on-site in suburban southern Sydney. In 2010, the Australian government agreed that high-level nuclear waste from the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation's Opal Research nuclear reactor that had been sent to the UK and France for reprocessing so that the valuable bits could be extracted would be returned to Australia as intermediate level waste to be stored in suburban Sydney. On the 11th of March 2010, the Fukushima nuclear disaster hits Japan, showing the danger of storing high-level radioactive waste on the roof, when an earthquake and tsunami blacked out the power to the water pumps that had been the only thing stopping the waste from spontaneously combusting into flames. In May 2011, the Muckaty Aboriginal Corporation, representing 6 of the 7 Aboriginal clans who own Muckaty Station, launched a federal court challenge against the Australian government's plan to build a national nuclear waste dump on their land. And now listen to Kylie Sambo with her hip-hop protest against the construction of a nuclear waste dump on her people's lands in Muckaty, near Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory.
I've come all the way up to share my message about the waste dump. Like all my elders have been talking very hard before, telling the government that they didn't want the waste dump to come to the land. One thing, these people didn't listen to us. We've asked them to come here and talk to us in Tennant Creek. We want to talk to you people. We want to tell you how we feel about our land. Our land is our spirit. Our land that keeps us strong. Yeah, let's begin our story now.
Don't waste the territory. This land means a lot to me. Been living here for centuries. This place we call marketing. Don't waste the territory. This land means a lot to me. Been living here for centuries. This place we call marketing. This is Millway dreaming. Sold out by the nuppers dealing. They've been hurting my feelings. I'm a gurunguru and I should have my say. Instead of the government's getting it their way. Say no to the waste dump. Waste dump. No to the waste dump. Waste dump. Dump. Don't waste the territory. This land means a lot to me. Been living here for centuries. This place we call marketing. Don't waste the territory. This land means a lot to me. Been living here for centuries. This place we call marketing.
Start listening. We don't want nothing to come to our land. Start listening. We don't want nothing to come to our land. Start listening. We don't want nothing to come to our land. Start listening. We want you people to support us.
I used to chill back at my hometown. Now I'm bound to lead on my young crew. Selling your land isn't tight. Let's get together and fight for our rights. Planting your poison in our land just to get some cash in your hand. You're drilling a hole right through my soul. Right through my soul. Right through my soul. Don't waste the territory. This land means a lot to me. Been living here for centuries. This place we call marketing. Don't waste the territory. This land means a lot to me. Been living here for centuries. This place we call marketing.
That was Kylie Sambo singing against the construction of a nuclear waste dump in Muckaty. In July 2011, the European Union passed a law that radioactive waste can only be exported to a nation outside the EU if that nation has in operation a deep underground radioactive waste dump that is geologically stable. This scuppered any remaining plans for importing waste from the UK and France to be stored in Australia. April 2012, the National Radioactive Waste Management Act came into effect, requiring that the land for a national nuclear waste repository must be volunteered rather than taken by force. In April 2016, the Australian government provisionally chose Barnaduda near Hawker in the Northern Flinders Ranges of South Australia for a national nuclear dump. You're listening to Ian Woolf on Diffusion Science Radio. Send emails to science@diffusionradio.com. We're brought to you across Australia on the Community Radio Network and podcast over the internet on www.diffusionradio.com. Now, in 2019, the Australian government proposes to build a national nuclear waste dump that will permanently dispose of low-level radioactive waste and temporarily store intermediate-level waste. Temporarily? Where's it going to go permanently? They've offered a $10 million bribe to any Indigenous community that volunteers their land and is chosen. They're looking into 2 sites near Kimba in the Northern Territory, and still that one site at Hawker near Wallabadina Station in South Australia. The Aboriginal community living at the Hawker site were excluded from a vote on whether the community supports a nuclear waste dump in their area. Geological investigation had already desecrated a sacred women's area. The community is divided. Some people feel that even if only one person gets a job, it's worth any cost because the community is so desperate, while others feel strongly that a national nuclear waste dump would be a terrible thing for their culture and for their health. Federal Minister Matt Canavan asked the District Council of Kimba in the Northern Territory to also hold a vote amongst residents for putting a national nuclear waste dump on their local Aboriginal land, so that he can say that the local community supports his plans. The District Council of Kimba deliberately excluded the Aboriginal owners of the land from voting based on their race. The Barngala Determination Aboriginal Corporation, who own the land that the federal government wishes to build on, took the Kimba Council to federal court for violating their human rights under the Australian Racial Discrimination Act 1973. Some defenders of the government have suggested that the council was in its rights to exclude the Aboriginal residents of the land from voting because they were outside the voting catchment area. Of course, that would mean that the land they live on is somehow in the council's area while the people living on it were not. Justice White recently heard the case and decided that stopping the people voting because they're black somehow isn't racial discrimination. You can't make these things up. As it stands, Australia still doesn't have a national nuclear waste dump, and there are no plans for a deep, geologically stable, flood-free storage facility to permanently dump intermediate level waste. And now, to continue the celebration of 50 years since humans landed on the moon, here I am from 2000 talking about sex in space.
While getting amorous in space is a fantasy for some, it's a serious question for those of us with a purely scientific desire to know if having sex in microgravity would be wonderful or fraught with technical problems. Peter Pesavino's article, The Psychological and Social Effects of Isolation on Earth and in Space, appears in the academic journal Quest. It's an in-depth and personal piece which lays bare the mysteries of how humans handle themselves, and sometimes others, during extended space missions. According to Pesavino, NASA thinks that sex is just a very small part of the lack of any physical connection with loved ones when astronauts are in orbit, and therefore only even thought about with married astronauts. Since sex in the United States is often a very controversial subject, NASA public relations simply avoid releasing any information about what sorts of extracurricular activities might be happening up there. Astronaut Alan Bean commented that an all-male crew is a good way to prevent jealousy, something he believes could be a problem with a mixed crew when not everyone was participating. In the book Living in Space, former NASA consultant G. Harry Stein said that the neutral buoyancy tank that's used for astronaut training at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, was also used, both officially and unofficially, to see whether people could shag without gravitational pull. The verdict was possible but difficult. He also explained that the tank experiments revealed that sex in zero gravity would be easier if a helpful astronaut was available to assist the copulating couple by holding one of the two participants in place. Pesavento said that Russians have a more open attitude towards sex in space, noting that the Institute of Biomedical Problems have been involved for decades in sexual studies of living creatures in space. In the past, they actually had plans to film a sex documentary on board the Mir space station. Cosmonaut Polyakov particularly discourages the use of the sort of inflatable friends that you can buy at an adult bookstore. The trouble with such toys, the cosmonaut said, is that anyone who's using such things may develop the so-called doll syndrome. They start preferring the doll to a real partner even after they return to Earth. People have had sad experiences of using such things using long-lasting stays in Antarctica and sea voyages.
And finally, a blast from Diffusion's past. Here's Gina Sartore from 2001 with The Daughter of Time.
Hello and welcome to The Daughter of Time. Well, ancient Greece and things that began there have been somewhat on our minds of late. Rather than trying to dodge the issue, pretend it's not there, or even hide under the bed with my fingers in my ears, I'd like to exploit what they told us is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and start off a smallish series on the origins of something almost as important as sport. I refer, of course, to philosophy. I'd like to talk about a group of early philosophers, cosmologists and physicists known as the pre-Socratics. I say philosophers, cosmologists, physicists because while those terms didn't exist at the time, the pre-Socratics were all three. The first meaning of pre-Socratic is fairly obvious. These were philosophers living before the time of Socrates. However, there is a secondary meaning too. The work of the pre-Socratics became overshadowed by the vastly more influential Socrates, his apologist Plato, and Aristotle. Pythagoras was certainly influential in the later development of Western thought, in a mystical kind of way, but as a whole they're remembered, if at all, only as handmaidens to the big guys, a sort of overture to be rushed through before the curtain can go up. And yet in many ways their work seems much less strange and outlandish to us than, say, the final causes of Aristotle, or the perfect disembodied essences of the Platonic realm. The pre-Socratics were much more your humble, sleeves-rolled-up experimentalists. They even came up with the idea of the atom 2,500 years ago. So over the next few weeks I'll give you a survey of these 10 or so men, who were among the first people we know of to have asked the question, why does the world behave the way it does? The three members of the Malaysian school, Thales, Anaximander and Anaximenes, all tried to answer that question by determining the fundamental composition of the world. Miletus was a Greek trading city in Asia Minor. We don't know too much about any of the three who made it famous. However, Thales, credited with being the first philosopher, successfully predicted an eclipse in 585 BC. Not necessarily a startling achievement, as Miletus had links with Babylon, where astronomers had already noted that eclipses occur cyclically. More importantly, he seems to have introduced geometry to Greece from Egypt, and to have developed it into a formal science of theorem and proof, rather than Egyptian rule of thumb. The fundamental element, according to Thales, is water, and all other substances are formed from it. Anaximander was born around 600 BC. He held that everything comes from a primal, eternal, ageless substance which is the fundamental composition of our world and others as well. He considered that a kind of natural law or balance kept the proportions of all the substances we see in check. His argument was that none of the traditional elements, earth, air, fire or water, could be the primal one, or it would conquer all the others. Fire and water, earth and air are all in opposition, and the fundamental element must be neutral. Anaximander also believed in evolved, not created worlds, with evolved life, including humans. Our universe was in constant motion and had been so eternally. Anaximenes lived after this time, and certainly before 494 BC, because that's when Miletus was destroyed by the Persians. He held that air is the fundamental substance. While this seems a little less neat than Anaximander's account, he actually tries to explain how this primal substance turns into other elements. Air is rarefied into fire, and condensed into water, then further condensed to make earth, then condensed further again to make stone. Thus, all the elements are basically the same stuff, under different degrees of condensation. The important thing about the Malaysian philosophers is not whether or not they were right. After all, they weren't. It's that they tried to ask sensible questions and answer them rationally without resorting to moral, religious, or anthropomorphic explanations.
And that's all from us this week on Diffusion. Are you a scientist, artist, biohacker or maker who'd like to be interviewed about your work? Would your company like to sponsor Diffusion? Send your contributions, opinions, helpful suggestions and donations to science@diffusionradio.com. That's science@diffusionradio.com. Please like the Diffusion Science Radio page on Facebook and rate us on iTunes. Tell your friends. Follow me on Twitter @Ian Woolf. I produce Diffusion, which is broadcast around Australia to 28 stations on the Community Radio Network, including 2RBM in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, 8CCC in Alice Springs and Tennant Creek, 2NVR in Nambucca Valley, 3MVR in the Mallee Border districts of Victoria and South Australia, City Park Radio 7LTN in Launceston, Tasmania, 2XXFM in Canberra, and my local station, 2RDJ in Burwood, New South Wales. Diffusion is syndicated globally on the National Science Foundation's Science 360 internet radio station and also on astronomy.fm. Subscribe to the podcast on the Diffusion website, www.diffusionradio.com. That's www.diffusionradio.com, and check the website for links, photos and videos about this week's show. If you enjoyed the show, you can explore more than 950 previous episodes archived on diffusionradio.com, where the shows are labelled by keywords so you can focus in on the stories you want to hear. Join my patrons at patreon.com/diffusionradio. Make a donation through paypal.me/IanWolf. Subscribe to the Diffusion YouTube channel at youtube.com/c/diffusionradio. I'm Ian Woolf. Join us inside your audio device of choice for more science wondering next week on Diffusion Science Radio.
Science is fun. It helps you to learn, to know, and to appreciate. When you study science, you may go on field trips. You discover the marvelous interrelationships between all living things. You learn to read the history of the Earth as it is written in rocks and fossils. You find out what makes things tick, everything from a molecule to a living organism. In the study of science is found the most useful and satisfying knowledge of man. Knowledge of his physical world, its past, its present, and its future. And in your moments of relaxation, now and in the years to come, you will find the study of science leading you into fascinating pursuits. Photography, collecting. Why study science? Study science because you will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.